So, dear all, welcome again to this first issue of the 2025 UNESCO Chair in Disaster Risk Reduction and Engineering webinar series. I will be very pleased to introduce in a little while Dr. Solveig Tarvsvadottir or Race Consulting, and she will talk about a very interesting topics. But as we have done in previous year, I would like to start the year with the first disaster of the year. Last year was the 1st of January Noto earthquake. This year we have been confronted with the wildfires in Los Angeles that started on 7th of January. Thankfully, the death toll has been very minor, 25 people, with respect to other disasters that we face worldwide. Nonetheless, the area that was acted upon the fire was covered 45 square miles with fires in 5 different localities. At least 180,000 residents were evacuated, and it is estimated that at least 10,000 structures have been destroyed. And the pictures that you are seeing here is the neighborhood of Altadena, not distance from just north of Pasadena, where a neighborhood of high density, which was almost completely destroyed. As we can see from these two maps here, although the Pasadena fire maybe had more time, more television time or media time, because they are housing the actors and well-known people from the Hollywood area. Altadena is actually a much higher density population and was in more working class area, and was and therefore affected a much larger proportion of the Los Angeles population, also with less resources in terms of rebuilding. So as always, we need to look at who's affected and at the equity of the post-disaster recovery. As you know, we are particularly interested in the effects on schools of the wildfires, and at least 3 schools will need a total rebuild. But it was, at least these are news of the 21st January, at least 335 schools in the area of Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside, Ventura, and San Diego's counties had closed temporarily when the fire broke, and affecting more than 211,000 students. These are figures from the California Department of Education. The issue very often was that even when they, mitigation are trying to be identified, such as displaced children looking for alternative schools where to have lectures, it was found that the neighboring schools were also had been also badly affected or burnt down. And not only that, but in many occasions, people have been evacuated. Their school have been affected by the fires, have been burned down, and therefore, even if the schools are surviving it, not having a home and not having all the tools that make the school life of a child possible, means that many children cannot yet restarts education. Even in a location like Los Angeles, where you have all the possible technology and facilities at hand, is not so easy. The recovery can be affected by several issues, and some very basic one that sometimes we don't think about. Moving on to our new set of webinars. So today I will shortly introduce Dr. Solveig Thorsvadottir, or Rain Race Iceland, talking about and next week I will talk about, next month we will have Professor Solomon Tesfamarian of Waterloo University in Canada talking about tall timber design under earthquake and fire loads, past, present, and future. In March, we will have Dr. Sinan Akkar and Erdem Karabstan from TÜRK Turkey talking about academic and professional approaches to CAT modeling. And finally, in April, Dr. Sonia Giovinazzi from Enea Italy, it's the energy agency, the Italian energy agency, talking about multi-criteria life cycle approach for school infrastructures improvement in the Kyrgyz Republic. As always, you can find more information about all of this in our on our website at the UNESCO Chair Educational Activity. But now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Solveig Thorsvadottir. She is the director of Rain Race Consultancy, a firm dealing with disaster preparedness. She has an undergraduate degree in civil engineering, a master's in earthquake engineering, and a PhD in disaster-related management systems. Solveig is very active in research and in search and rescues, mainly urban search and rescues. She has been on disaster missions for the Icelandic Rescue Team, the United Nations, and the International Red Cross. Between 1996 and 2003, Solveig was also the director of the Icelandic Disaster Management Agency. So she has been able to look at the issue of disaster and preparedness and recovery from many different points of view. Solveig teaches disaster risk management at the University of Iceland and works with the Icelandic Rescue Training School on developing disaster training material. She has also been involved in numerous EU projects, and this is how we initially met a few years ago, and works for her local fire department and is on the board of disaster for her local municipality. Her diverse background has led to a keen interest in stakeholder relationship. I should also add that this talk is also part of the dissemination activity of the European Mediate Horizon project that we are both partners on. Thank you very much, Solveig, for accepting to come to our webinar, and I'll pass you the screen and the mic.
Thank you very much, Dina, and I really am honored to be here today. I'm actually sitting here in London with Dina, and thank you all for coming to this webinar. I am going to share my screen. Okay, so share screen. Share, and I am going to put, okay, so you see my screen now and the title slide? Okay, excellent. So the name of the talk today is Fostering Stakeholder Collaboration Towards Disaster Resilience. And let's just jump into the overview. So first, I want to tell you a little bit about my background, but I can skip a lot of it because Dean has already told you, and the motivation that is driving this research. The research I'll be talking about is probably now like 10 years old. Well, it's been developing in 10 years old, but it's also brand new. Some of it we just finished a few days ago. I want to walk you through how we are building a theoretical disaster-related management system using system thinking, system dynamics, and management systems. And then show you an example of where we're using feedback to analyze the Icelandic disaster risk reduction program for avalanches and landslides. and then to show you a simulation model of a section of our theoretical model. And then finally to talk about organized stakeholder collaboration. But we're also going to pick up on the topic of stakeholder collaboration along the way. Okay, so start with the background and motivation. So I'm a civil engineer. I have a master's degree in earthquake engineering from Johns Hopkins University and a PhD in disaster-related management systems. Dina has told you about my diverse background. I have also worked in construction. I've worked in risk analysis. I worked in disasters, the university setting, worked with rescue teams or emergency services as a consultant. And then these are the different rescue teams, mountain search and rescue, urban search and rescue, UN, the Red Cross in multiple countries. And this has given me the perspective of how important it is we have to work together. We have to come together to build a picture. And so that is sort of the key motivation, the experience from these disasters, working in pre-disaster and the learning process or the lack thereof. This is an overwhelmingly complex environment. And as much as we'd like to control it, it is of course not 100% controllable when you have lots of people working all over the place doing either part of the system or doing their own thing. So the questions is how to control what we can control. As engineers, we want to control things. We're not just leaving things up to chance. We want to make the world a better place. So what can we control and how do we control it? Also, another question that comes up often for me is how to convince governments and staff that this topic matters. I don't know how much time I've spent trying to convince people that this is an important topic without getting anywhere. So that is also a motivation. The heart of this topic and the heart of this presentation is a web-based disaster-related support tool that I am going to get back to later in this talk. But I want to mention it here because the first part of the talk is explaining to you how we got to this decision support tool and a motivating factor, which is to avoid concepts as much as possible and use variables as much as possible. I've been on 6 EU projects, and I think every single one of them starts with long discussions from all the disciplines about words, concepts. What do they mean? What does risk mean? What does exposure mean? What does a scenario mean? But if you take words and stick a unit to it, then it becomes really clear what it is. So that's another motivation. I want to acknowledge that I'm using Stella software for this program or for the web-based tool, and nobody does anything alone. There are loads of people all over the place that have contributed to this work, but I particularly want to mention Rod McDonald, who's a professor at James Madison University in the US, who's been a tremendous mentor in helping building the model, and a colleague of mine, Matthias Papes, who has been working frantically with me this past month in getting the tool ready online for use. Okay, so moving on. So building a theoretical disaster-related management system. So how did we approach that? Well, we start with systems thinking. And if you read Donella Meadows' book, Thinking in Systems of Primer, it's an excellent book to explain the basics of how to think in systems. And she says that defining a system, you need 3 things. You need the elements, you need the interconnectedness between the elements, and you need to have a function or a purpose for all of those elements when they come together. Now, the easiest example, of course, is just the human body. It's made out of multiple elements that come together so that we can exist as humans. So when we're trying to understand a system, the first thing that we try to do is to dissect the elements the system into elements. And we've all seen pictures from the olden days, or even drawings when they were doing these autopsies and trying to understand how the body works. The interesting thing, it doesn't have to be a physical element. It can also be something like emotion or something like hope. You can have high hopes or low hopes, and that can also be an element in the system. And then you put it back together again. You try to find how it's put back together, to find the interconnectedness. And by doing so, you make the basic operating unit of a system, which is the feedback loop. And then you have system dynamics. That is about feedback control, getting to the word that we like, control, we want to control our environment. It integrates all these different functional areas, and it gives us a quantitative basis for designing more effective organizational policy. These are the three tools. The first is the causal loop diagram, where you just draw the feedbacks, like you have a population, the more population, you have more births, the more births, you have more population. The arrows are in the same direction, so it's a reinforcing loop. More population, more deaths, more deaths, the less population. They're opposing arrows, so it's a balancing loop. And then the stock and flow simulation models, which are the actual computer models that you can then run and get your results. So we're going to build a theoretical model using the systems thinking approach. So we need these three things: elements, interconnectedness, and function. But we're going to start with the function. So systems thinking rule number one, find the function or determine the function. Now, we don't have a system yet. So we look at it from a goal perspective, but as explained in systems thinking, goal and function is not the same thing, which for me was eye-opening when I thought about this. The goal is what you want the system to do. The function is what it actually does. And having this distinction helped me when I thought back on these discussions I had with people about the system not working when they're talking to the government. And the government would, staff officials would answer me back with describing it does work, and then it would describe the goals. And I knew they were correct in their goals, but now I have words to say, yes, that is the actual goal of your system, but how does it actually function? That's a different thing. So we need to develop a disaster-related goal. So what we did was we took the problem, we took the definition of a disaster from UNISDR in 2009, which says that the disaster is a serious disruption of the functioning of a society with lots of losses and impacts and our ability, or which exceeds our ability to cope. If we take the inverse of that, we can get our goal. We have a well-functioning society with a low risk of something happens, and then when something happens, we can cope. Now, getting to a pet peeve of mine regarding avoiding words and using variable, there's a big problem with the word disaster, because we talk about post-disaster recovery. But if disaster means serious disruption, that means you are actually doing recovery while you still have serious disruption. So you still have a disaster. So talking about post-disaster recovery doesn't really make any sense. But again, if we move away from these words and talk about variables, that will be helpful. Okay, so we have a goal. Now we need to look at the elements. How are we going to tear this apart? If you think of a disaster situation, you think about risk management, that lots of things are going on, and you want to tear it apart into its elements. Well, here we're going to use the concept of a management system from ISO to help us define the elements. So they say that the management system is the objectives of an organization to reach its goal and the procedures that they use to implement them. Okay, we already have our goal. This could be any organization, so we're left with objectives and procedures. In 2014, we published a paper where we justified 8 objectives that were developed from the original disaster life cycle. So we had disaster-related objectives, that were developed from the original life cycle. And each of these objectives are leading some management function. So management function is just the work and the activity that needs to be done to reach the objective. So we call them disaster-related objectives and disaster management functions. Now, these 8 are something that you are all very familiar with. The first is to understand disaster risk, so that would be risk analysis. The second is to measurably reduce known disaster risk or risk mitigation. The third is to prepare now for possible future operations, which is just operations preparedness. Then we get into the operations themselves, and the first we call impact operations, which is to work with the or try to control the threatening situations and the damaging processes. This is really important for when you have a time-dependent event. We up in Iceland, for example, have had a lot of volcanic eruptions recently, and this is a major part of our work to try to control actually the lava and where it's flowing. Then we have saving lives, and then we have all the temporary solutions, the recovery, and it's extremely important to differentiate between what is temporary and what is final. There are many cases of something is done to help people. It's supposed to just be temporary, and it turns out to be final. And then the most forgotten one is to learn from your experience. And it is my experience that people are changed after dealing with disaster, and so they have a new insight, and they can use this insight to learn from. Okay, so we have the objectives. Now, some of you might think, well, I would prefer some other objectives. That's fine. The structure of what we're building then would just be slightly different from you, but the way we're building it, the approach is the same. But we have to have procedures for these objectives. So in previous work, we defined 4 to 5 procedures for each of these objectives. Again, this is just standard stuff. You'll be very familiar with the risk analysis. The first one is just hazard. The next one is exposure. Third one is vulnerability. The fourth one is doing the scenarios. And risk mitigation, you're just identifying, analyzing, comparing, implementing. Preparedness is the same for all of the operations, developing standard operating procedures, establishing facilities, etc. And then we have procedures, basic procedures for each type of the operations. These are all important, but there can be others, but we just wanted to have a set so we could have material to work with. And then we have the learning, which you can do the first one actually before the disaster, which is a very good idea to have some guidelines, but the rest you can only do afterwards. So this brings us to the first stakeholder sort of stop that we're going to do. If you look at all these procedures, you can immediately see that there are many, many stakeholders involved in this process. Some of them are defining the problem, some are working on solutions in reducing the problem, some are working on solution in preparing what can happen. So collectively, all these different stakeholders contribute to the large, complex management system. So the elements of a theoretical disaster-related management system, we have the goal, we have objectives, and we have 33 objective-related procedures. Now, systems thinking rule number 3 says that we have to look at interconnectedness. So they're telling us to look backwards, look at the feedback. And up until I had read about the systems approach, I had always seen disasters as a consequence chain. Something happens and there's a consequence and then another consequence, which leads to another consequence. And I always thought about it in chains. And I don't know how many consequence chains I've drawn, but systems thinking made me think backwards to look for the feedback. So I went and I said, okay, we have all these objectives. If A affects B, well, how does B, if B changes, that does affect A? And based on this work, we actually developed 25 more procedures. Because yes, there definitely is a relationship. So these are what we call the inter-objective procedures. So now we have like 58 procedures that we can work with. So when we look at the interconnectedness, we basically have two-level feedback. First, we have the sort of the big picture. We have what's happening before the operations, during the operations, and after the operations, how the different phases basically are affected. And we have feedback within each of the phases. So the risk analysis, mitigation, and preparedness, all the operations, and then from the learning. So if we try to make a causal loop diagram of this, we can see the three different phases. So the first one is the box that says at the top there, disaster preparedness. The second one is the operations box. And the third one is basically the whole picture. Can you see my mouse?
Yeah, yes, okay. We can.
And all of these are driven by something. Something activates this. So in the first box here, where we have perceived risk, if there is no perceived risk, then nothing will happen. But once you have perceived risk, which drives the risk, the more risk you have, the more mitigation you can do. The more mitigation you can do, the risk will go down. The more risk you have, the more preparedness you can do. The more preparedness do, the risk can go down. And the more risk mitigation you do, then you can reduce the preparedness. So this is happening at some period. And then you have increased risk and actual damages occurring. That will activate the operations. And so they have their relationship. And once you have your operations, that will activate an experience where you can learn from experience. But I want to highlight that that doesn't automatically mean that you will improve. There has to be a motivation from going from, yes, I have all this experience and I can think about it, but systematically making your risk management better for the next one takes some motivation. So now we're getting to see how our sort of feedback system looks for a disaster related management system. And then we can start taking more of our procedures and start building more and more detailed causal loop diagrams. But what you find as you start putting more and more into these diagrams, it becomes very complex very soon. And you start sort of losing control. And that's when you start get disillusioned. Or I started getting disillusioned with this. How it's just too complicated. But then system dynamics comes in and tell you to, well, don't worry, you're not supposed to model the system, you will model the problem. If you try to model a system, like the entire system of everything, you end up modeling the whole world because basically everything is connected. But you have a problem, and that is what you model. And of course, then you model as many problems as you need. Then you get to, okay, so what are our problem? Whose problem? And from what perspective are you trying to solve these problems? So here's another sort of milestone or a step in looking at our stakeholders. We'd already established that we had lots of stakeholders working on different parts of the objectives and procedures. But we also realized that they also look at the system differently. You can have owners, users, developers, and beneficiaries. Owners, users, and beneficiaries come from soft systems, Chuckland and friends, but I've added here system developers. So an owner can be Parliament, who says, okay, we're going to have an institution that makes these makes some system, the municipality, a company. The users are anybody who is working within the system. Developers, which I think many of us who are here now today, we are developers. We're providing information to those who are either going to use it or are the owners. And of course, there's the system beneficiaries. Okay, the example that we are going to walk through now of using feedback to analyze the function of the Icelandic DRR program for avalanches and landslides, which is part of the Mediate project. And here I'm very purposely using the word function because it is actually not fulfilling its goal. And now with this approach, I have tools to talk about that. Okay, so this is Iceland. When I was young, I always had to tell people where Iceland was, but the world has changed today and people seem to know where it is. So I'm not putting a map of the world here, but in 1995, we had some major avalanches here in the West Fjord that killed 34 people. And then the government decided we are going to revamp our hazard assessment, risk assessment, and mitigation for avalanches and landslides. And 9 municipalities were included in the program. And I'm going to talk about one, which is here in the East Fjord, in this location, which is called Seyðisfjörður. This is a very important fjord because this is where the ferry from mainland Europe comes to. And this fjord has a long history and has had large and small populations. Now we have a few hundred people living there. And you can see the boxes here on the right. They are showing where the main places are, sources of avalanche and landslides. And there has been a problem through the years. First, the buildings were down by the sea, but through the years, they've been going further and further up the hill, making the problem worse. So this is a 3-decade-long risk reduction program. The hazard maps were ready for all these 9 areas in 2002, and the program was meant to be finished in 2010. That was the goal. But the program keeps getting expanded and there are delays, so it is still ongoing. And if you delay mitigation, you are opening up the risk of something happening. And this is what happened in 2020. In a span of 1 week, 24 landslides fell onto the town, leading to evacuations and damages. And here you see the biggest of those 24 landslides. And even 2 weeks ago, the town was evacuated due to avalanche threats. So the law entails monitoring routine to monitor the weather, hazard analysis, mitigation, barrier design and construction, land use planning changes, meaning once you have the mitigation, you should be able to live underneath these barriers, and also evacuations, because we don't completely trust the mitigation, so we want to be able to evacuate the people, even though we are hoping that all the buildings will be safe because of the mitigation barriers. The law states who the stakeholders are, which is really convenient and good to have that in the law. The first 2 are the government, national and local. The next 2 are committees that are set up just to manage this program, and the rest are standard agencies in Iceland. So using a system dynamics approach, we looked at the timeline and we looked at how the governing stakeholders change, meaning what was the main thing in the very beginning that was making the decisions, and that was in perceived risk. The next thing that was critical was political will, because without political will, nothing happens at this scale, at least. And then administration comes in, and then the assessment starts. And then later below, again, we look at perceived risk, and then we're looking at hazard assessments. And you begin to see that there's sort of, it's not a straight line. They keep revisiting various categories, and the key stakeholders, sort of, it's like the ball keeps going back to different stakeholders, indicating feedback. And another thing that systems approach tells you to do is to specifically look for delays. So we looked for delays and we found 3 categories. One was the main categories was just deviation from the original plan. They brought in new municipalities to be in the project. They decided to cut down the funding when a large power point was built because of sort of overheating in the economy. Then there are unavoidable delays like the weather, and then there are unintended consequences like the IMO staff being overwhelmed due to so much work being done that things had to be slowed down. So we took this information and we put it into a causal loop diagram to help understand sort of how everything is connected. So we start with the avalanches and the political will and the money factor, getting money, and that activates the risk assessments. While doing the risk assessment, they find that climate change is actually affecting more than they think. So they need to go and get more money, continue the risk assessments. Then they start the mitigation design. So they have to go up in the hills and start designing the barriers. And then they realize that there is more risk assessment that they need to do. So they need to go back and get more money, continue the risk assessments, to continue the design and continue the mitigation. And then you need to constantly monitor the effectiveness of the mitigation, which of course is just 0 until you have something built. And then you look at the risk gap, and the risk gap will activate the political will. As the risk gap closes, the political will goes down. And then, of course, if the mitigation is low, there's the likelihood of a disaster. So all these green arrows are relating to this disaster. And that's, of course, then what happened. We did have a disaster. So by analyzing this, we found that sort of the risk and the policy regarding the risk, monetary issues, delays, and the consequences of delays were the sort of fundamental factors. And if you want to know more about that, then I suggest you read our reports from Mediate. Okay, so what did this add to sort of thinking about stakeholders? Well, first of all, it was who is legally responsible and who is volunteer. So we have a law that says these people are legally responsible, but there are also people who are volunteering to be part of this, like the Red Cross and rescue teams, who are trained and who are not trained, who choose to be part of this response. Like if you go and work with the police or the fire department, you're kind of saying, well, I'm willing to be involved when something big like this happens. Whereas if you are the IT guy at the municipality, you're not thinking, I'm going to be involved in disasters, but you are by default because you work there and there was a disaster that hit your community. And then also, would stakeholders make the same decisions as they did in all these big delays if they could see the situation from a feedback perspective? That's something that we have yet to test by showing people the results of the project. Another thing that came up was regarding municipalities that they, or regarding that different stakeholders can actually take on multiple roles when it's based on looking at a system. And municipalities can fit in all categories. They are the owners, they're legally responsible, they use it, they develop it, and they can also be hit, so they can be beneficiaries. Okay, the simulation model of a section of our theoretical model. So we have been modeling part of the system. These are the objectives that we have been using: risk mitigation, preparedness for relief and recovery, and then some relief and recovery operations. We are looking at 5 policies or strategies. The first is just your current mitigation based and operations preparedness, which we call baseline. And then what your resilience is if you increase your mitigation, if you increase your recovery preparedness, if you increase your relief preparedness, and then if you do all. The variables of interest that we used were buildings. They could be at risk, they could be mitigated, then we have an earthquake, and they could be damaged and repaired. And then we have families. They could be in their own homes, they can be in emergency settings, so they can be in tents, they can be in mass care centers, they can even be in their cars or with family, hotels. And then there's temporary housing, where they're actually moved to proper housing, but it's temporary, and then back in repaired homes. Now, the percentages there are just made up percentages, where we're saying if you are in your home or repaired home, you are contributing fully to society. In emergency setting, you might be able to contribute a tiny weeny bit. Let's say, it's your contributing could be your work, contributing could also be going to school. But it will be better if you're in a temporary housing, but it's still going to be interrupted. So these were our variables of interest. The operations that we were using, which is showing our resilience, our ability to bounce back, we have recovery operations. So we used resources regarding repair crews, how many repair crews you have, what is the repair rate, and then coordination, which is a little bit more difficult to model, but it is extremely important that we try to include it. How long is it going to take you from the time of the event to actually have a fully functioning coordination system? If you are very prepared, you're going to be quick in getting up to speed. If you have little preparedness, you're going to take more time to get up to speed. Then we have relief operations. So we have resources, we have processing teams. How many teams do you have that process the families from emergency settings to mass care centers? And then, of course, we can look at the consequences. So here we have what the model looks like. So this is the same picture as before. At the end of this talk, I'm going to try to open up the online version and use that. But just in case technology doesn't work, I want to explain this just using PowerPoint. So here on the left, you can see the variables that you can actually change. The first is the time of the earthquake. And the second is the damages caused by the earthquake. Now, in a full model, obviously, you would have different damage states. But for this first proof of concept, you just pick a percentage. And then you can pick how many crews you have, and then how effective they are, the repair rate. And if you read papers from the earthquake in New Zealand, you can see how this is incredibly important. It is not enough to just have lots of repair crews. They have to be efficient. And then you have the variables that affect your experience, and then here the relief teams. So in this graph, so on the left-hand side, you have the number of buildings, and so there is no damaged buildings here. Then the earthquake happens, and then we have, I don't know, this is kind of random, just, I don't know, 750 buildings. So here you have 1,000 buildings, and this is just single family dwellings, just to make it easy. So here's the number of buildings that get damaged, and then eventually there will be repair, and then they're all repaired. And then as they're repaired, the families move into their homes. But so we have families over here on the right. So when the earthquake happens, all the families are here, but they are gradually moved from the emergency settings into the temporary housing. But as the repairs are happening, they gradually move into their homes. And the next page, sorry, let's see. Yes, okay. I wanted to say that the numbers are just chosen so the graphs look nice. So that, I mean, the lines are all separated. But sometimes it is the direction of change or the comparison that is enough. But we need actual data to for the actual numbers to mean something. Yes, I will. And then here is the contribution to society. So when everybody is contributing 100%, we're up here, and then an earthquake happens, and then people are in emergency centers, and then gradually they move back home. So the percentage goes back up. So we have this page to play with. Oops. Yes. Okay. And then the second page is based on the decisions you make before the operations, your disaster risk management. Is it going to make a difference? So we have mitigation, which is just funds per month. We have the recovery preparedness, which is supposed to then affect your ability in acquiring crews, and repair coordination. So your effect to your ability to get the coordination running up quickly. And then relief preparedness, so the effect of acquiring teams. So this is the second page. And you can see here we have mitigation. So if you play with this, then this value here goes down. So you can see that the mitigation is here. If you play with these, then the recovery makes it go faster. And here is the next page. And this is added here, this teal line, which shows if you do both recovery and mitigation. And this brings us to the point of designing these interfaces. That is actually quite an important thing. Matthias and I, when we were working on these graphs, we made many more graphs, and we realized that this was overwhelming, and how many pages to add. So that's a completely new thing to think about. It's like, how much information should you be sharing so that people like a mayor or governments are not overwhelmed by what you're showing? So it makes you think, what is really important to show? And the look, that takes a lot of time too. Okay, so here is the contribution to society. The blue was the baseline. The yellow is increasing your relief capability. So you're moving people into temporary housing much faster. That means they can contribute faster. Here is more faster recovery, so they're going faster into their homes. Here is the mitigation, and the teal is the one that's combined. And then you can play with these numbers here to see how this changes. So if we want to add real data, because that's of course the goal, to add real data, and we found, based on a recommendation from Laurie Johnson in California, that we can access California Risk Mitigation Program data. This is a program that's been, I don't know, 15 years. By using their information, we can model it realistically. What we're doing now is we're just calculating the costs, saying there's some fraction of funds, and that calculates the rate of mitigation. But if we read what they're doing, we can get much more detail about how this actually should be modeled, where you have the homeowners, their potential, and then their applicants, and then they get into the program, and then they're in secure homes. And then you have the homes where you have the buildings at risk, buildings in the program, the mitigated buildings. This is all determined by decisions from FEMA, the program itself, and from the Office of Emergency Services of how much money they want to put in this. So the point here is just to say that once we can get our hands on real data, we can actually model whatever it is that and change the model so to reflect what the problem is that we're trying to look at. We want to also get, or we can get real data from these eruptions in Grindavik. which is actually quite an interesting problem. There's been long-term temporary housing now for over a year. This is the Blue Lagoon. Some of you might have gone in it. This is the lava that is coming, threatening, is now in the car park. And these machines here are frantically trying to close the gap here to make sure that the lava doesn't flow into the Blue Lagoon. Okay, so organized stakeholder collaboration, our last section here. What could be a way to help support stakeholder collaboration is to look at these collaboration points. For example, when will the earthquake happen? Now, people, obviously, we don't know exactly, but there are people who work on early warning and trying to let us know in more and more detail. So there'll be a group of people working on that. Loss estimation tells us what to expect regarding damages, and there are lots of people who are working on that point. Mitigation, there's lots of people who are working on that point. How long does it take you to actually start the recovery operations? How effective are your recovery operations? The tail end is often just ignored because there's so little left that the attention of politicians is no longer on this disaster. They're looking at other things. And also, if you are on the green curve and you're moving people into homes, you want to know how fast this is going regarding the repair. And if you are supporting people in temporary housing, then you are also interested in the repair because you want to get people out of the temporary housing. And the same thing with if you are managing the emergency care center, you want to get them out of there as soon as possible and into the temporary settings. So there are many different points that are where lots of different stakeholders are working at. So the question is whether we can make these collaboration groups based on where the different stakeholders are working together. So these are just examples of all sorts of different stakeholders that are working at the different nodes. And if one of these groups changes something in that graph, the whole graph will change. It will affect the work of others. So they will be interested in knowing, like the people who are working on moving people into repaired homes, they will be very interested if the loss estimation people are reducing the value. So it's not just a matter of making a picture. Let's make curves. That's sort of the main message from here. And what I have found when I've been showing my colleagues, and here you see Benedikt Halldórsson, a colleague from Iceland, when he saw these curves, he went and immediately started drawing on it and doing his own analysis and finding out, so where am I in this model and what could I affect? Could I make this curve steeper or could I make it lower? And that's exactly the fact that we're wanting to have, that people see themselves in these curves and that people tell us, okay, I could do this to make this curve better. And so then we can have stakeholder management. We can ask stakeholders, what are your user, developer, beneficiary, or all of these? Which procedures are you working towards? And of course, we have to take uncertainties and additional procedures into account and look for gaps if there are procedures that are not addressed. And then we have stakeholder groups that then work on these similar topics, and they will provide information on how things should be modeled and the data and additional models that should be made. And stakeholder management then just becomes normal project management. And then we have the model that everybody contributes to. So if some stakeholder groups make some progress, the model then changes for everybody. And then we can work with the the decision makers. I really don't like the word decision makers, but I think everybody knows we're referring to the people sort of in power, like the governments and the local governments. And once we show them these graphs, then maybe we can get more questions from them and try to answer their questions. Okay, next step for this project is documentation, journal papers, and more modeling. And there are some references that we've been using. And now for the final part here, we're going to test technology and see if I can open up the, yay, it worked. Okay. So this is the web-based version. So this is the first page. And if I change the time of the earthquake, it will move like that. If I change the numbers, it will change like that. And if I change the number of repair crews, it will affect. And I'm just going to go to the next page here. Here we have mitigation. So if we change mitigation, if we change recovery, and here we have both, and then here we have contributions to society. So if we change the mitigation, that will change. If we change the recovery. So yeah, so once the stakeholder groups bring in their information, we can adjust accordingly. So that's the presentation. Thank you very much. This is, like I said, if you have suggestions, that would be really, we would really welcome it. But otherwise, we're also here if you have any questions. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Solveig. Indeed, we have some questions, so we will try to swiftly work through our switch on, switch off mics as we are in the same room. There is a first question from Ajay Lal. Actually, Ajay Lal, we have collaborated on a very interesting project in Nepal for quite a few years. I don't know if Ajay, you are online and you would like to open your microphone. You can briefly introduce yourself and ask the question yourself.
Hi, yes, I am online. I think I am audible.
Yes, you are audible. Thank you.
For connecting me to this very important, seminar or maybe the presentation. I have been continuously participating in this program, and this I think the topic was very, very pertinent in context of disaster risk management. The problem that I raised the question, like the system is so complex and there are too many, stakeholders when the disaster strikes. Not only the people who are affected, but the institutions that come together to, assist or to come for rescue, relief, or maybe response. In that context, everybody is having his or her own interest at that point of time. In that context, it really becomes very, very complex to identify what should be done, what is the problem, for whom it is a problem, and who is basically responsible. In that context, how this systematic modeling, system thinking, or this modeling can, provide us certain, better ways to identify the role that we can have in that situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Yes, you're absolutely right. It is incredibly complex. So basically, where do you start? How do you sort of define the problem? Well, if we talk about from the perspective of a society, what I like to do is start from the perspective of how is a well-run society? How do we manage society on a daily basis? So going to a municipality and looking at how they're organized on a daily basis, going to the national government and looking at how they're structured on a daily basis. What are the departments? How do they operate? And then what will happen if that system can no longer function? And what will be the consequences of that? And how do you need to, what do you need to do to help them get back on their feet? So basically, going to understand how to solve a problem, what I like to do is to go, what is the situation where it's functioning well? How does that work? How can it be damaged? And look at it from that perspective, which means also that then you have many problems that you need to solve. You need to take each department, like of a municipality, and think about, okay, what is the problem here and how do we fix it for each of the different departments? So that's from the government and municipality perspective. If you're a company, you would break down your company into your different operating departments, and then think, okay, if the finance department is affected, or the marketing is affected, or and so forth. Does that answer? I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you to some extent. Yes, only thing was like I was looking from the perspective of the community who is basically affected, and like the different system, different institutions think from their own perspective rather than the community who are really affected due to the disaster and hazards. So that's the problem arises during these events. So, but yes, I think you're right that each system has to be analyzed independently.
And then together. Yes.
Very much, Jailal, for your contribution, and thanks for the answer, Solveig. We have a question from Hamra Fatima. I don't know, Hamra, if you are online and you want to answer, or you want to present your questions, or I will read it.
I understand the question, so that's okay.
Yes, so our numbers assigned to factors like recovery preparedness.
Yes.
Yes.
In this particular model, it is only the amount of resources that you're putting in, like money. How much money are you putting into having a preparedness program, and how much are you expecting it to take to getting your preparedness up to level that you want? Like you might put in $1 million, but if you're going to take 1 million days, that's not going to be very effective. But that's just now for our theoretical modeling. But if we would start doing this when we start doing this in more detail, we would look at the procedures. Like we have in the procedures, you need to have standard operating procedures for assessment, for recovery assessment, for relief assessment, and you need to make sure that you get going quickly. So that would be a factor into measuring your effectiveness. You need to build facilities, you need to have communication networks. Do you have these, or how far along are you in these? That would be a factor. Do you have contingency plans? That would be something that you could measure. Do you have training? So you could make a variable based on what you would like these procedures, where you would like to be, and how far you are in this, and then you could sort of measure your progress towards them. So that's sort of what we were thinking. Thank you.
Solveig, for the answer. And we have a question for Richard Hughes. I don't know, Richard, again, if you are online, your mic is open if you want.
Okay, hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. I've worked quite a lot in earthquakes and somewhat in floods, and it seems to me that what one is looking for in a disaster is not going back to the status quo of the pre-disaster situation, but you really want to build back better. So you want to change the disaster into opportunity, rather than just going back to the status quo. And therefore, there may well be, in the theory of it, in systems thinking, the possibility of there being an acceptable disaster. Clearly, a disaster that doesn't kill is a prime objective, kills people or creates significant damage to the economy or to local culture. But it could be that there are opportunities that the disaster gives for doing something better, whether it's physically better with tangible attributes or with intangible attributes, which seems to be of increasing importance to UNESCO and the UN. So if you look at the international charters for intangible cultural heritage. So it's this concept, is there, in the theory of systems thinking, an acceptable disaster? Thank you.
I think in the theory of systems thinking, you can basically find everything. But as far as our model goes, what we did in the immediate work, which I decided to skip it because in this presentation because I thought it was getting too long, but now I regret it. Is the issue of targets. And it's in systems thinking and in dynamic system dynamics, you can actually model targets. And one of the things that we found is the importance of the relationship between targets that, okay, so we have a risk policy that we want to reach, but we also have to have a disaster policy that the disaster work is not too overwhelming, and that the recovery work is not so overwhelming that our staff becomes completely overloaded. So we can define what you term as an acceptable disaster, and put it into the model and see what we need to do regarding disaster risk management to achieve that type of to reach our targets during the operations. So yeah, I think that's extremely important. There's one thing that I want to mention about building back better, that I think is rather complicated. I've been involved in numerous disasters where we're trying to help people sort of get back on their feet, and you always have to deal with the issue that there's a finite amount of money that people are putting into recovery, and you may be faced with the question, are you going to help everybody get back to the same level, or are you going to build stronger buildings which cost more money and then you can help fewer people? And that is a question I've been grappling with, and I've asked people at conferences, how do we make that decision? And I haven't gotten an answer yet that I know how to answer. That's seems to be something that people who are deciding where the money goes have to decide. But any kind of guidance on how we can balance that question would be very good to hear. Thanks.
Thank you much again, Solveig, for the further insight. And of course, building back better, it is one of the targets of any global institutions towards disaster risk reductions, it would be better to build fast better rather than building back better. But that's the preparedness matter that it's very difficult to convince government about. We have Liz Olaya. I don't know if, no, sorry, there was another question before. Can the system map be spatially segmented?
Yes, you could make models for different areas. So that would be easy. I'm not quite sure what you mean, whether directly like connecting it to GIS. So you have like spatial mapping. I'm sure you can do that somehow. I don't know how to do it, but I'm sure there's a way. So yes, the answer is yes.
And is then from Liz Olaya. I don't know if you are online and you would like to spoke up the question yourself, Liz. Are you there? You can open your mic. No, she doesn't seem to be there. So have you considered expanding this model to other sectors beyond infrastructure?
Yes. But the challenge that we have right now is that this model can be expanded in any which way you want to take it. And we could spend the rest of our lives modeling all these different sectors. What we will be doing will be trying to focus on real life problems that we have, either clients or research problems. Because like we talked about, I mean, this is endless. You can go into any sector to model it and choose any which variables that you're interested in. But we will be guided by what we get research money for or clients for.
Very interesting, actually, because that's take us back to real life, and there are many questions coming. So yes, I think we will be here for a while in this very interesting discussion. What if we are leading a team, but there is a lot of strife, disagreements? How do we work towards the collaboration you spoke of?
Okay, this is interesting. I have not thought about this. I guess one of the things that we could do is if somebody says, this is going to be more effective, and somebody else says, this is going to be more effective, and they disagree, we can model both ways and see how, how does it change the graph? Is one providing more mitigation? Because some of these things are very complicated. There are lots of moving parts. Like if you saw, from the very little basic model of what was going on in California regarding their mitigation program, somebody may say, we should adopt that program, it's very good. And then maybe there's some other program in some other country that somebody else is saying, well, no, that's a much better program. And it might be intuitively not quite straightforward which is better, and that's why they're arguing. We could model both versions and see which is more effective. So that's one way, I think.
Thanks.
Great question.
Thank you. And the next question is from Professor Daya Shankar. I don't know if if Daya Shankar is online and you want to actually turn on your mic. Yes.
Hello. Very nice presentation. Could this system be applied for the California fire last 2 weeks happening there?
Yes, the system is not based on any particular hazard, even though we were using it for an earthquake. But it is equally applicable to any hazard. So yes, it could be, and that could actually be an interesting study to get the numbers from the fires and put it in there.
But in the case of earthquake, the damage and the casualty occur in a very short time. But here in the California fire, it was just firing maybe 2 weeks. So how you will get the data to feed your system?
Oh well, that would be easy. I mean, this is all time dependent. So you could add information about a fire that comes bit by bit. You could put it in a stock and move it along in the flow, so that is perfectly doable, and in many ways make the model more interesting because you have such a moving hazard. That's the same thing as with the eruptions in Grindavik in Iceland. We've had 8 of them now. So it's a very live hazard. Yeah, a time-dependent hazard is, like I said, in some ways more interesting than earthquakes because they take such a short time. But earthquakes are still very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very nice answer and presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Daya. And the next question comes from Dennis Sherwood. It would be nice if you briefly introduce yourself as you present your question so that also both the speakers and the others know who you are.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. I'm Dennis Sherwood. I'm very interested in systems thinking and its applications. And I'd like to build on a response you just gave, Solveig, about money. Your charts, very informative, but it struck me that mitigation in general was hugely effective. But mitigation costs money, which some would argue might be wasted if the disaster doesn't actually happen. So all of that money has gone down the drain and, the earthquake or the avalanche just never happened. I was wondering if you've had experience or what your experience is of having that discussion with people about the wisdom of investing in mitigation before it's too late. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes, you're absolutely right. The problem that we face as a community or as a world is we don't know where it's going to strike next. If we knew that, we could just focus all our efforts to those areas. But lots of people don't think things are going to happen ever in their lifetime. But what I think might work, and I'm hoping with this model, that we can show people with numbers the cost of mitigation versus the cost of response. If you compare the amount of money that California has to now spend to respond to what's going on, and not only like the official money that's going have to be spent, but the loss of productivity, these are huge amounts. And if you show them this amount versus the amount that mitigation costs, same thing with Iceland, with the mitigation that was being done and taking forever for the avalanche and the landslides, and then the cost of the actual disaster that happened. I mean, it's much, much more expensive to deal with the operations. So maybe I'm still working, trying to convince people, but I am hoping that we can use a model like this, put dollar values on them and show them. And also we need to have agencies that can help, like municipalities. And there are agencies out there, just like we have a national coordination system for disaster, or like for the emergency services. You have the civil protection, the national civil protection, who's there to coordinate on a national level if something happens. But many countries don't have the same thing to help the municipalities and in the long-term recovery. So, and some people just, when you talk about planning for recovery, even in today's world, they're saying, oh, that's actually something you can do. They don't realize you can plan and get the recovery going much faster and much better. So I agree with what you're saying, and I'm hoping that we can work on this by doing this comparison and putting money values on it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you, Solveig, for the answer. Actually, this is a very important topic of discussion, because very often the disaster and the entity of the disaster, so not the event in itself, but the outcome of the disaster, is functions of deregulation. And if regulation had been put in place beforehand, that would be part of the preparedness and mitigations, which of course are an investment. And that investment usually does not only prevent the disaster from happening, and therefore it's not an investment always towards that particular hazard, but it's towards a better being and a better existence for all the community involved. And this, it's very evident in, let's say, developing economies, but it appears also as also very evident in the Los Angeles fires. So to say that that would be money wasted, the fact is, it's not just the losses before the after the event that compound the value of the investment before the event, but it's also the level of regulations and equity and equality in the communities and in the economy that will actually develop better economies for the long term. So I think that we need to really switch our thinking and convince government that we need to think in a different way. But this probably is a discussion for another time. So there is an anonymous questions about how much complexity can the system map. Can you, for instance, model cascade failures of multiple interconnected systems, and like flood, water, energy, health, telecoms, transport?
The ability to model anything is there, just in the software and in the methodology. How much complexity can the system map? So the methodology can map as much as you want, but the problem becomes if you have a model that has too many or lots of moving parts, it gets more and more difficult for you as who's looking at the graphs to really understand what they mean, because there are so many different things that are moving them. So that's what we found when we were starting to model just this tiny, weeny little bit of a model that we were showing you, that when we moved the variables that we could move, we really have to think back. So what is actually happening in the model, and what is changing? So at the moment, I'm a bit, if I would try to start modeling something that is really, really complex and connected, it would have to be very high level. But then again, if you have a specific problem that you are asking, that is about these different systems that you want to connect, then maybe that can help to sort out what exactly it is that you want to model. So it goes always back to the question, what is the problem that you're trying to model? It doesn't have much of a purpose to just model everything as a system if you don't have a question or a problem you want to solve. But as far as the methodology, yes, it can be extremely complex, and there are models out there that are very, very complex. So yes, thank you.
Yes, and I suppose the first step here is to actually understand those connectivity first, and then model it, and then really check whether the connectivity works one way and it's only cascading, or whether it works two way and it's also influencing, and so on. And certainly the system dynamics would help in that aspect, and probably it would be a matter of building it up organically and step by step. Next questions is again from Liz Olaya. I don't know if you are now online or you are not, but she was asking whether in the context of climate change adaptation, do you think that the system structures would differ significantly, because it could be similarities and difference in the goals and functions?
So in the context of climate change, so every context has its own basic structure, just like we saw with the California example versus how we were doing it in this particular little theoretical model that we did. So what you need to do is do some research about how are things working for a particular stakeholder or situation that you're interested in. Do some research, just like we did for the disaster risk reduction program in Iceland. We had to learn about how they were working, and then, even though we didn't make a simulation model, we could build a simulation model based on the information that we gained. So if you have a climate change situation, a specific problem that you want to model, then you would just need to research how what are the basic elements, what are their connectedness, and then model that. And so if you're asking whether the basic structure for climate change adaptation is the same as for a disaster, I'm sure that's a big discussion that everybody and other people have more experience than I do. But for me, the way I think about it is that climate change is more about a very long-term disaster, and mitigation is you get to experience a bit of change and then change and experience a bit of change in the weather and adapt to it. So in that sense, it's the same, but drawn out. So I don't think there would be any problem modeling it, but it would be a bit more research to decide exactly how to do it.
Thank you again for your answer, Solveig. We now have Abbas Fatiaza. Abbas, I know that you are online, so if you wish to speak yourself, please go ahead.
Hello, Professor, can you hear me? Okay, first, thank you for the presentation. Especially the fact that we need to model the problem and not the system itself. So if I want to implement it in a bit of multi-hazard context, I wanted to ask your experiences during this modeling and interactions with your stakeholders. how you justified the residual interactions, I mean, excluding the residual interactions with other parts of system that is not included in your model, which is, let's say, the problem modeling. And what was the insights that you could share with me when I want to define these boundaries for defining my problem, excluding other parts of system? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. So what are the, if you're going to define, you're going to build a model for the problem. So how do you define the boundaries of the problem? That's actually a question I've not thought about in a way that I'm thinking about it right now. And how do you deal with the residual effects? So there are two things that come to mind. One, regarding the residual effects. One of the things that you learn about in systems dynamics is that when you're building a model with a group of people who actually are from the community that you're working with, there's a tendency to want to add more and more things to the model. And they say, this is important, this is important. And then when you actually do the modeling, you realize that, well, actually, many of these things that people thought were important turn out not to be important because they really have no effect in the model. You can change the variable to high or low, and it has very little effect. So that's one way of finding out what is important to your problem. But another thing is to define, going back to what I said before in finding a place where to start. What I like to do to find a place where to start is go to something that is a functioning system. Like if we're talking about a municipality or companies or whatever it will, a home or whatever is your system, first figure out how that works, and then define a problem. And then I think maybe it's like a ping pong game in the sense that you start your modeling, and if it becomes just too overwhelming, the model and the information and all the graphs that you get, that you lose a feeling for the answer that you're getting from the model, then you might need to backtrack and make the model a little bit more simpler so that you actually understand the answers. So those are my immediate thoughts. But I think that's a wonderful research question for all of us. In how do we actually put a boundary on defining these problems? And now you've put this research question out there, so definitely want to do more work on that and see if my initial thoughts are correct, that it's basically this ping pong game between making the model overly complex and versus you actually understand what the model is saying. Because like I said earlier, when you get all these graphs and you move something and you're trying to understand why this weird behavior comes, if the model is too complicated, you lose insight of what the model is actually telling you. But great point, thank you.
Thank you, Abbas, and thank you, Solveig. Indeed, that's a problem, a very important problem when we are doing system modeling, and clearly it affects also these aspects. There was an hand raised by Stuart Owukwu. I don't know if you are still online, Stuart, and if you want to speak, this is a good time now.
All right, thank you very much. It's a lovely topic. My name is Stuart Owukwu, and my area of specialty is on resilience planning and disaster risk management. Okay, yeah, I've gone through what all you said, You talk about system and the objectives, probably the goals. Now, in a situation whereby we have a system and we also have the goals, but sometimes they tend to be moribund, but only put into use when there's a disaster. What should we do about that? And in my profession, we say we plan with the people and not for the people. And if you have a working system, you don't know how these people bounce back to from this shock, but you decide to say, okay, this is what they want. This is what you want to give to them. Whereas that's not what they want. How do you solve all of those issues? Thank you.
Let's recap on the question. So the question is how to increase preparedness.
But
Hello?
also yes. My understanding is about also understanding what are the needs. What are the needs and how do you represent the needs of different stakeholders in your system?
Exactly.
The model is basically just modeling what has just been told. So it doesn't really evaluate the needs. So it would have to go and take a real situation and get that information and put it in the model. So I'm just thinking here. So needs, as in how much preparedness needs to be done. You could model. You could have a variable that is. You can say these are our needs. We need to have plans. We need to have training. We need to have facilities. Or maybe the simplest is like standard operation procedures and plans and training, and have that variable and have it virtually zero in the beginning, because you don't have a lot of these. But when you use the model to discuss with the stakeholders, you can point out this is a variable that's important, and if we increase this variable, then this is how the graphs will change. So in that way, you are pointing out what the needs are by, like for instance, in this model, we say we need repair crews. That's one thing that you need to have. And they need to have a good repair rate. You need to have coordination. So by putting these variables in the model, even though you don't have them, the model can be a talking basis for the stakeholders, because the variable's there on the page. And when this is more developed, there will be pages with the online version that actually explains more of these variables. And then maybe there could be documentation that also explains. But I think just by having the variable identified, you can then talk to the people that need to make the decisions, and you just point out this is a need, because and our value is very low. So I hope I answered your question.
Thank you very much. This is again another area of decision making in disaster risk reduction, which is very important, because the representations of the different stakeholders and how do we value their needs is something that goes well beyond the realm of the, let's say, more engineering aspects of it, but they are just as critical to the overall recovery. The next question is from Lisette Abril. Lisette, I don't know if you are online and you want to ask your questions, you're welcome to it. In which case I will just read it up. So thank you for the webinar. It was a very interesting topic. In the model, is there a possibility to include subsequent event? For example, if a new earthquake occurs during the reconstruction curve, could the timelines, community participation, resources, etc., be redefined?
Yes, it can. And that would be actually a very good thing to model. Because we obviously do have aftershocks. And so, yes, thank you for pointing that out.
Then thank you for the very synthetic answers. And we have a question from Mir Sumira. Mir, if you are online and you would like to unmute and present your question yourself, introducing yourself, please. Mir? She is not unmuting herself, so I will read it for you. How can damage be measured when a disaster would cause multiple organizations to suffer in a varied number of ways? Do you use any threshold to quantify the magnitude of cascading losses in your model?
So how can damage be measured when a disaster would cause multiple organizations to suffer in varied? Well, it's not a problem to model that. If you have multiple organizations and you define which organizations they are, and you have determined how they would suffer, and they suffered in multiple ways, you can definitely model that. The big challenge, of course, is saying exactly what those values would be. So the model is just a bridge between the scientists and the engineers and all of you versus the people that are then trying to make decisions or who can benefit from looking at the models. Do you use any thresholds to quantify the magnitude of scale? You can, if given information about the threshold, then you can model it. Yes.
And moving on, it's a question from Guillermo Olivares from Chile. Guillermo, if you are online and you would like to unmute yourself, please, you can ask the question. Hello, Guillermo. No.
Hello. Sorry for my English. Thank you very much, doctors. I'm an architect and a structural engineer, and there are many occasions we don't have the personnel specific to the task, and maybe the corps we can understand different roles with different peoples. Peoples like engineer could be help to the community with another tasking. Then it's possible for the roles of each stakeholder to be taken for other profiles or other people.
Yeah.
And how can this situation represented in the model system?
The model itself does not identify, like, if an engineer would take on the role of somebody else. If I understand you correctly, it's the engineer is maybe doing something that is not exactly their profession. Just as an extreme example, an engineer is taking the role of a medical person in a hospital because there is nobody in the hospital and something needs to be done. So the model itself does not classify the background of the people. But that's an interesting question that I've never thought about. But I mean, obviously there is a lot of crossover. People in a disaster, people do things that just needs to be done. And I think is it important to capture it in the model? Well, maybe you would say that the medical help that's being given is not maybe as good as it would have been if these were medical professionals. Now, I may be way off base here. Maybe your question is not regarding this. But I think what you're talking about is really important. And maybe just we would need to talk more about what exactly how this affects the actual operation, and once we know more, then we could model it. But that's a very good point. Thank you.
Thanks again. Yes, indeed, using the idea of also modeling the skills of the respondent, it's quite an interesting area of research. I think we have one question from Atefe Darcy. Atefe is actually working in Iceland, I believe. And Atefe, if you would like to speak.
Hi, Dina. Thank you for having me. So I have a very quick question. I was wondering if Solveig, you have already considered applying your system for the Grindavik case, which was very interesting, of course, case to study. I mean, the town was evacuated, of course, after a very recent volcanic eruptions, and I was wondering, what mitigation actions could have been helpful or at least less costly, rather than building a wall, maybe, which was, of course, a successful plan, to deviate the magma from the town. And yeah, since we already know what happened, what has been done so far, so if you could have planned something that could be better in terms of mitigation.
Thank you. Hi, Atefe. Yes, it would be actually really fantastic if we would model the Grindavik situation, because there's so much to learn. Regarding mitigation, yes, there is a fundamental factor that we keep getting wrong and could fix, and maybe if we model it and show it, it will get more traction, and that's in land use planning. The houses that were most affected by the earthquakes due to the eruptions were built on fault lines that were known to be above open like tunnels, well, open tunnels, let's just say tunnels, the people in Grindavik, they knew about these tunnels that are created during the eruptions. I think they're called volcanic or lava tunnels. So the planning authorities decided to build on these anyway. And we have situations like this regarding avalanches, where people are building when they know that there have been avalanches there before. So we really need to look at our land use planning and make sure that we adhere to what we know about activities, hazardous activities. The question always is the same one. that people don't believe anything is going to happen. Nobody believed that Reykjanes was going to wake up and start erupting, because it's what, 700 years since the last episode was. So that's one of the things that we should try to do. It's more difficult regarding mitigation, the lava flow, because where the lava is going to go depends so much on where it comes up. But on the other hand, where lava has flown once, it can flow again. So in that sense, you could say, should Grindavik should ever been built? But then half of Iceland should not be built because there's so much lava everywhere. And the lava actually created really, really good harbor facilities. So Grindavik is one of the biggest fishing ports in Iceland. So that's one of the things that also you could do in a model like this. You could bring in factors, feedback factors, that affect mitigation and land use planning decisions based on economy. Like, this is a really, really good place to have a harbor. It's like farms. It's really good to have farms near volcanoes because of the nutritions that the ash gives. So this is a huge balancing act. So definitely we should work on modeling that. Another thing that we could model regarding Grindavik is about the recovery and the buying of homes that's going on. So eventually, after a long time, the government decided to buy up homes for people who had to leave. But now there's a lot of problems among the homeowners who are selling their homes to this company that is a government company that's buying the homes, because of people not getting the same value, or they feel they're not getting the same value for their homes, and people acting like, well, this has never happened before, we're doing this for the first time. But this is exactly the same problem we had in the avalanches in 1995. So one of the things that we can do with these models is to maintain people's memory about these different situations. So if we can make a model and say, this is what happened in 1995, and then somebody says in 2025, oh, this has never happened before, we can go back and get this and says, yes, we did. We have had the exact same problem numerous years ago. So so definitely, let's work together and get some funding and do some research on that. Thanks.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you very much, both Atefe and Solveig, for this more, insightful question and answer on a specific issue, which goes again back to the issue about regulations and mitigation that we were talking about earlier. That mitigation is an extreme of having not had the regulations before. So I think that with this one, we will close after almost 1 hour of discussion following this very, very interesting presentation from Solveig Tolsvadottir. We would like very much to thank her and all the audience for a very lively discussion and a very enjoyable webinar altogether. Thank you very much, Solveig, and thank you to all the audience for attending. Goodbye and see you next month. There is still somebody with their hands up. Armien Aloyro.
You know that you're the